Hi, welcome back. We've been going through What is Philosophy by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. Last time we actually stepped outside of this text in particular to look at Deleuze's notion of needing concepts. And to do that, we examined a little section of a lecture that he gave around 10 years prior to the writing of this book. This time, we're going to be jumping back into the text. We're still in Chapter 1, What is a Concept? And at this point, we're going to be looking at a particular question that Deleuze and Guattari make reference to at the top of page 16, very top of the page, and that is the question of which concept is first. Now, hearkening back to what we explored last time, the need for concepts, one of the things that can actually produce the need for a concept, especially when we're looking at the work of Deleuze and Guattari, is a badly posed question. This is something that Deleuze and Guattari find irritating, and they like to solve the problem of badly posed questions, perhaps you've already guessed, by forming new and better concepts. As they explain, concepts are only created as a function of problems which are thought to be badly understood or else badly posed. So at the top of page 16 in What is Philosophy, the authors introduce precisely such a question. They ask, on what conditions is a concept first? Not absolutely, but in relation to another. Now, they aren't asking this question because they're looking for an answer. Rather, they are looking to point out that there's something wrong with the question itself. And so by the end of this talk, I hope to show a little bit more clearly why it is that they think this question is badly posed. Like all philosophical questions, this one is connected to some sort of problem, or at the very least, what appears to be a problem. In this case, the question of which concept is first refers to a problem of hierarchies. So for any two concepts which might in some way be related to one another, we're asking which of these concepts should occupy a privileged status? Which concept should we say allows for the other concept? Now, Deleuze and Guattari are quick to distinguish this question of hierarchies from the question of genetics. In other words, from questions of origins, of chronology. That's why they make a point of saying not absolutely, but in relation to another. And it's important that they make this distinction because what they're saying is this question is not asking which concept came first, but which concept is first. The latter question is much more staggering because it is precisely the sort of question that lends itself to chaos, most often the sort of chaos that follows from problems of infinite regress. The chronological question, on the other hand, is comparatively easier to answer. Maybe not completely easy, but easier. Because the relevant information we would need to answer that question would involve just looking at the history of, in this case, a concept. And while Deleuze and Guattari say that every concept has a history, that is, of course, not the only thing that every concept has. So the question of which concept came first is not really the question that they're focusing on. They're talking about a relational question. And when we ask which concept is first in relation to another, the only relevant information that we have access to is the relationship itself. But the relationship between the concepts, well, that's what we want to know about. So we need to step outside of that relationship. But then we run into another issue. Because when we step outside of one relationship between one set of concepts, we step inside of another relationship between another set of concepts. And since we would end up having to ask the same question of this new set of concepts and their relationship, we are thrust into infinite regress. That seems like a pretty big problem, but maybe that's just part of philosophy, right? Philosophy is dealing with these big, complicated questions. I'm sure Deleuze and Guattari would probably agree with that to some extent. But they also think that philosophers need to be asking the right questions. And a lot of times, they don't think philosophers ask the right questions, because for Deleuze and Guattari, a lot of other philosophers are not focused on the right problems. For them, the question of which concept is first is just one of many, many questions in philosophy, which, for all their dazzling complexity, don't actually emerge from real problems. Deleuze and Guattari seem to think that many of the big, important problems that philosophers have puzzled over and pulled their hair out over for centuries are actually premised on problems that aren't as real or as meaningful as they might appear to be. One classic example of such a question, one which is very similar to the one that they're focusing on here, had been posed by the philosopher Gottfried Leibniz, who famously asked, "Why is there something rather than nothing?" Leibniz thought this was a meaningful question to ask, and why not? He thought it was related to something that was a real problem, namely the problem of being and non-being. Plenty of other philosophers before Leibniz and after Leibniz seemed to feel the same way. In fact, this has been called the fundamental problem of metaphysics. One thing to notice about this question is that in posing it, one is already presupposing that hierarchies exist. The only problem in this case is determining how the hierarchy is expressed. So we know there's a hierarchy. We know that being and non-being are in some kind of relationship where one has to be privileged over the other. That's just like a given. Now the only big mystery is figuring out which one is privileged over which. But what if that's a mistake? For Deleuze and Guattari, it is a mistake to suppose that there are hierarchies among concepts. And the reason for this follows from the way in which they understand concepts to actually relate to one another, and the way in which they understand concepts to come into being. First, concepts for Deleuze and Guattari do not come into being from one another in the same way that, like, a fruit grows on a tree. It's not like philosophers have the task of simply plucking concepts from branches. Deleuze has a similar analogy in another of his lectures where he says that concepts are not like floating around in the clouds and we just pluck them out of the sky. It's very important for Deleuze and Guattari that we understand concepts are not ready-made. We have to make them. Philosophy and its concepts are a creative activity. Concepts are the result of creation. The activity of philosophy produces them. But to suggest that one concept might be primary with respect to some other concept seems to imply something very different. If there is some concept upon which another concept depends, well, then that secondary concept doesn't need to be created. It will just emerge naturally, necessarily, in the same way that eventually an apple will grow from an apple tree. But that's not how Deleuze and Guattari think concepts work. So the implication here is that by posing a hierarchical question, we are already inserting something that Deleuze and Guattari think isn't there. We're misunderstanding how concepts actually relate to one another. We are supposing that concepts relate to one another in the same way that a fruit relates to a tree. In Deleuzian terms, we are supposing that concepts relate to one another in a way that is arborescent, to borrow a term they use in A Thousand Plateaus. But in fact, or maybe I shouldn't say in fact, but at least in Deleuze and Guattari's view, there is not some singular point upon which everything else hangs or depends or around which everything orbits. That's not how they think about things. For them, the flow of concepts and the activity that produces them is infinitely more complex and can't be reduced to something that is like very ordered. Thus, there is no sense in which one concept can be thought of as first and the other as second. Everything appears all at once. And so the problem isn't the difficulty of answering the question. The problem is that we've posed the question in the first place. The problem that this question relates back to, in Deleuze and Guattari's view, is not a real problem. Now that is an issue. That's the issue that Deleuze and Guattari are trying to underscore here, is that if philosophers are conducting their inquiries with certain assumptions in mind, assumptions which may be unfounded, then this is undoubtedly going to end up producing problems that are not real, and perhaps worst of all, it might draw philosophers' attention away from problems that are real. We're focusing on the wrong things. Deleuze and Guattari's understanding of what constitutes a real problem was heavily informed by the work of another French philosopher, Henri Bergson. Bergson criticized the very foundation upon which philosophers had historically posed metaphysical questions. In other words, Bergson posited that many of the big, important questions that philosophers had been asking were themselves premised upon notions which were, at one end, trivial, or tautological is the word he uses, and then at the other end, absurd. Now, among others, Bergson actually offered the question of why is there something rather than nothing as a great example of what he called a pseudo-problem or a false problem. A problem that isn't real precisely because it only emerges due to a misapprehension from the start. So think of it like this. Say you're trying to screw in a screw with a hammer. That's going to produce problems. Those problems only emerge because you're using the wrong tool for the wrong activity. To say that that is a problem that deserves much attention is kind of absurd. It's kind of silly, right? Because the real solution is, well, put down the hammer and get a screwdriver. Very simple. Now, Deleuze and Guattari take this novel and controversial idea that Bergson offers, this critique of the fundamental questions of metaphysics, the things that philosophers are all supposed to be worried about and care about. They take this and they kind of run with it, and they start applying it all over the place. This is precisely why Deleuze and Guattari try to undercut philosophy so often. It's not because they don't care about philosophy. It's not because they don't like philosophy. It's quite the opposite. They really, really do care. They really do think philosophy is important and that it matters. And that's why they want philosophers to be focusing on the correct problems and asking the correct questions. This might explain, at least in part, why Deleuze and Guattari feel the need to create so many new concepts and so many neologisms and combinations of different things that to many people are very confusing, to many people are very frustrating to read. Maybe the reason they do that is because they really feel that other philosophers haven't even really started off on the right foot. And so that's why Deleuze and Guattari say, well, hey, we just got to start from scratch. Let's create something new.